99.1 KLBP, Low Power FM, Long Beach.
Dean claims that he knows next to nothing
I don't know
about Marvel Comics, but
I know X-Men, and there's some guy with a hammer, and there's a green guy.
You know who the guy with the hammer is.
And the guy with the hammer and the green guy.
That guy with the
hammer. Who would win in a battle? That's all anybody cares about.
You know what? Most people do care about who's going to win between Thor and the Hulk. You are correct, sir. You are correct, sir. But the love... Okay, first off, let's back up here. You didn't want to talk about the movies because you say you don't really... you don't have a lot of love for the movies, but...
Okay, can I say something serious about this? The reason why I don't want to talk about the movies is one of the things I think about our show is we're trying to bring people to things they may not know about.
Okay, here's what I'm saying.
So that's why I'm saying let's go to...
I don't want to talk about the movies. I'm saying this. If Marvel Comics in the last 40, 50 years, because it's really been around in good standing since 1963...
Right.
The movies wouldn't be as alarmingly popular as they are if it weren't for the fact that the comics themselves did a lot. I'll tell you what Marvel Comics did, all right? We talked about DC Comics last week. In many respects, and we might have mentioned this actually, but DC Comics can be looked at as a large mythology. We mentioned the fact that the Justice League characters are very much like the Roman and Greek gods, right? You can go down name by name and compare them to classical Greek mythology.
Where the Marvel, I remember we were talking about, and I see they're disaffected teenagers.
This is another way of putting it, and this is what Marvel really glommed onto in the early mid-'60s and even through the 70s and 80s. Marvel figured out that there's a market for gods and mythology. Americans love mythology in a number of different ways. What Marvel stumbled on is that there's also a great need for the everyman. While it could be argued that Clark Kent is in some respects an everyman, Bruce Wayne definitely isn't. Diana Prince definitely isn't. In other words, even in their civilian identities, the DC characters are so far removed from anything resembling the average Joe's life that it's hard to connect with them on an emotional level.
Correct.
Marvel figured out in the 60s, 70s, and again through the 80s that, you know what? You just play with the idea that Peter Parker, more than Spider-Man, the stories are about Peter Parker. More than the X-Men, the stories are about the individual characters in the various countries they came from and playing with the cultures that they came from. The Marvel characters made superheroes relatable. And in a way, it wasn't just the civilian identities. It was also the power sets and the teams of the Marvel characters.
Sure.
The Avengers are large-scale mythological characters.
Remind me who the Avengers are.
Captain America and Thor and the Hulk and the big league Marvel characters.
Originally, it was the Kirby Stan Lee creation. Yes,
more or less.
Okay.
Yeah, the Kirby characters, the big, huge characters. But most of the Marvel characters, and the ones that are even really popular right now, like, say, on Netflix, Luke Cage, Daredevil, these characters weren't big, heavy hitters. They didn't have massive, quote-unquote, power sets like Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern. They were just quirky, radioactive, activated...
mutants, right?
Mutants and transformed characters. But I'll give you a simple example. One of the stories I remember really loving as a kid... I don't remember anything about the villain or the plot. I just remember that Spider-Man had a cold. That Peter Parker was like...
Like there's an issue where he's got a cold?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just remember him sniffling and sneezing and having to take off his mask and blow his nose. I can't remember all the details. But as like a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, I just thought, at some level, it connected with me because I realized Peter Parker was just a dude like me. And Peter Parker was a kid in high school, at least in the formative years of Marvel, and he got picked on by other kids.
Right.
And he didn't get picked on because he was playing the weakling, like Clark Kent. He got picked on because he was kind of a nerd, and he was backward, and he couldn't play sports. And, that was a lot of comic book,
did he also,
geeks
by
like
chance,
me.
to get picked on because he was doing the right thing as Peter Parker? Was that ever
He was morally nerdy. Yeah, he was really honestly trying to be a good person. And, the bullies don't like that.
Right.
And, the Marvel characters, again, they had a way of connecting with the average reader in a way that the DC characters really couldn't. And I say that, by the way, I lean DC. I'm between the two big publishing companies and these two big, massive multiverses of characters. I lean DC for a number of reasons, but Marvel really connected with me too, especially as a teenager. I think as an older reader, I can still read the big, Grant Morrison Superman stories and get something out of it. It's harder for me to get as much out of the Marvel characters as I could as a teen, partly because I think it's marketed towards maybe a younger audience.
Okay, so there might be, maybe in the Marvel world, they're not allowing their writers to grow up, their characters to mature. Is Peter Parker kind of pretty much a stunted, 20-year-old? I don't know enough about this. Is that what the problem?
I don't think either, be honest, I don't think either company has really allowed their characters much.
No,
much
growth,
growth,
Superman never really ages, and Batman never really gets much older. But even Frank Miller was allowed to age Batman, and Batman did have silver hair.
Well, okay, how about
on the
this?
temples at one point.
Another thing about Marvel Comics that I think I really glommed onto, more than DC for sure, they got dirty.
Marvel?
The Marvel characters.
Dirty?
Dirty,
Give me some dirty.
Not dirty sexually. Dirty, like dirty, like they did things that were morally questionable. And we were talking about the goodness of Peter Parker, but by the time you hit the 80s, I mean, let's fast forward from 1963, where Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, a number of other really big-time artists, Herb Trimp, when those guys created the bulk of what is now the Marvel universe of characters that people are loving in these movies, by the 80s, Marvel allowed itself to go kind of dark. One of the earliest memories I have as an early Marvel comic book reader is Daredevil.
I've read a bit of those.
And Matt Murdock became this kind of, and if you watch the Netflix series now, you'll see that darkness of the 80s stories.
I won't.
know you won't. But you'll see that reflected. I mean, they're taking right from these 80s Frank Miller stories.
Right.
One of my earliest memories as a 13-year-old or so of reading comics is reading these Daredevil comics where, for example, Daredevil's fighting Bullseye, this
Is that the
assassin,
insane
crazy assassin character
I've
who
read
just
these.
kills his lover, Daredevil's lover, Elektra, kills people indiscriminately for money, and they're battling atop the skyscrapers because that's what superheroes do, and they're on this like telephone wire, and at one point, Daredevil just kind of jumps on the telephone wire. Bullseye kind of springs off it, starts to fall, and Daredevil, being the hero that he is, reaches out his hand, catches Bullseye, the villain, by one arm, and arm and wrist type of thing, and then Bullseye starts ranting. This is what you do. You save me every time.
Right,
I'm just going to get
this.
out of jail. I'm going to kill more people. And Matt Murdock, Daredevil, just lets go with him. And there's this beautiful, long, vertical series of panels that Frank Miller draws, and Klaus Janson had a big role in the art.
For sure.
And you just see him plummet like 4 stories to what ends up not being his death. But Daredevil's ready to kill him, though. But
That's my beef.
They never die.
Yeah,
They never
that was a really powerful scene, but I did read these. You handed these to me, and I read them. I got that far.
Give Frank Miller his props, though. He's a quadriplegic at the very least, right? He's broken his neck and back. He's living in a body cast in the hospital.
Let it happen.
But when
he did kill Elektra, though, I was going to mention that. Like
Bullseye killed Elektra.
But when I said he, I meant Frank Miller killed Elektra.
Miller, sure.
I guess she was fairly popular.
Yeah.
And allowed her to stay dead, because that's a lot of times in superhero books. Somebody gets killed, and they go, "Okay, we're going to reboot it." Or
Frank Miller did bring her back.
We're going to
about
bring
3 years.
Superman back. It really wasn't.
He brought her back about 3 years later, but yeah.
Oh, see, okay, another beef about
this
superheroes.
Is the thing.
That's my other beef.
Without the idea of whether or not let's be real, the trademark characters are licensed properties. No licensed property that brings in money is ever going to stay dead. It's a legal issue, a money issue, more than it's a storytelling.
And that's
issue.
what ruins art always, right? You bring the money into it, it ruins it.
For sure. But the gist of this point is that a hero who for 25 or so years played pretty much your stock, typical heroic figure, contemplated murder and was ready to let it happen. And it was just an accident of fate that Bullseye doesn't die. Daredevil's ready to murder this guy, and he literally murders. I mean, just because he doesn't die doesn't mean, it's attempted murder, I guess.
Right.
And for comics,
I got a question.
That was a big deal.
I know you were against the whatever the latest superhero movie was, that Superman killed Zod, kills him. Like, I know you weren't real happy with that choice that the filmmakers made. And then here is a choice where you got Matt Murdock, Daredevil, who does kill a bad guy. Why is one okay and the other not?
I think in my mind, especially at that age, it was in part because, and this is geek talk in part, but it's also, it's moral. It's discussion of ethos and ethics, or I guess ethics and morality. In part because Superman can always find a better way because he is, in terms of his power set, a god. In terms of Marvel characters, I think I was willing to, and even now, willing to suspend my desire to have them be so purely moral, Because they're more vigilantes. The bulk of Marvel characters...
If you're going to say Superman's a god and then the Daredevil's a human.
Right.
But I mean, I understand Superman being a god, but Superman comes from a culture that did have corruption in it. He comes from a culture that destroyed itself. I mean, they're obviously very much an analog for humans. So why does he have to be perfect if he comes from an imperfect world? You know, Krypton was imperfect. Why does he have to be perfect? Just because he's a survivor?
Total geek talk, of course, but I mean, you have to remember there's lots of different versions of Krypton. And
this is not cool talk. This is not cool talk.
I'm rereading all these old 1938. It is cool talk. It's cool.
I know
nerd is cool. Come on, especially right now. Let's ride that wave while nerd is totally in. All right, don't deprive me of that. We have another 2 years maybe before everybody's sick of these movies and it goes back to being I'm an outcast.
So
let's ride this wave for my sake. Well. In the original Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster story, in the very simple origin story that they wrote, Krypton just died of old age. It wasn't necessarily corruption. There's been lots of different types of Kryptons, I guess, versions of it, right? You know, every generation has its own Krypton, its own Superman. But I guess what I'm saying is those Marvel characters, I don't have as much of a... I'm not as much of a stickler for their personal morality because they can't run at light speed or push a moon out of its orbit. They're guys who are fighting with truncheons and staffs,
kicks.
And they're kung fu martial
Fists.
Arts dudes, and that's not every Marvel character, but I think the power sets of these Marvel characters, the milieu, is that the right way I'm pronouncing that, within which these stories take place, they'll... It is an illusion, and that's part of. Thank you, Teo. And I think when I look at the Marvel universe, when I look at the DC universe, I like the fact that illusory as it is, right? That these stories, even the Marvel stories, somewhat smaller scale as they may be, are morality tales, right? And again, when I talk about my love, I'm backing up a little bit and bouncing off of Teo's.
I had no idea what that illusion was.
Intervention. Well, Say it again. I'm sorry.
I didn't know what the illusion was. Teo, I got lost in the illusion. Jeff?
That's okay. I don't know what the illusion is.
Okay.
The illusion. Illusion. Right? Illusion.
Well, it's an allusion to a piece of other work, so it's an illusion.
I think that we got to remember that the love of superheroes, at least for me and a lot of guys my age, right, is the fact that as reductionist as the stories may be, as simplistic and maybe even childlike as the characters are, that like mythology and religion, which is its sister, that these stories still speak to me on a very primal level that isn't necessarily merely childlike, that they reflect maybe simplistic moralities, but they're still powerful ones. And a Marvel character, as opposed to a DC character, I guess what I'm saying here, is that a Marvel character sometimes has to make harder decisions than a guy who can move a moon out of its orbit. And seeing those harder decisions because their power sets are a little bit, smaller, they are more relatable as morality tales. I can understand why Daredevil might want to drop Bullseye 4 stories down and be done with it. Superman somehow, even though he's not a perfect figure, both his power sets and his, I guess just the archetypal nature of his character make it less ethically plausible that Superman would just go, I'm done with you, Lex, and drop him 4 stories. It's just somehow it's not as doable with that character.
I'm not sure if I 100% agree with you, but that's all right. It's not something I'm going to debate you.
Ask me a question. I feel like I'm doing most of the
I wanted to throw
in,
because you mentioned before we started characters.
Yeah.
And you said Rom, Micronauts, and Doctor Strange, and I was like, I don't know really. I know a little bit about Doctor Strange. The other two I know a little bit just from hearing you talk. But let me be student. Choose one and roll.
Micronauts,
go. Okay, here's what I'm going to tell you about what I know about Micronauts. I will do my best with Micronauts. My clock turned off, so who knows when this is over. Teo will have to wave over there in the window or give us a that's all, folks, and we'll move on. So Micronauts, Bill Mantlo?
Yeah.
And apparently he died in a very awful way.
Didn't he's still alive?
He's still alive. He's brain damaged.
He has difficulties.
From a bicycle accident.
He has to be taken care of.
It was based on a cartoon first, but
Actually, a set of toys.
Set of toys, sorry.
Yep.
But it became its own thing. And that's all I know about it. Oh, and then one of the other things you've always lauded was an amazing letterer who lettered each character in a different fashion to communicate their different type of voice. So that's all I know. So
well, you know what?
Go. What's the love for
let's
this?
let's take a quick little break, and I'll try to answer that question about Micronauts. This is 99.1 KLBP. And Rebecca, KLBP 99.1. I did and again.
Curse you, Eric Fiegel.
We were told not to bring it back with and I keep on saying and. This DC and Marvel discussion is slightly less professional somehow, but I think I'm having fun regardless talking about it. You asked about Micronauts. I think I could,
What's your love for this?
My love of Micronauts came in part from the fact that it was based on a bunch of toys, and I think, put it this way, I guess I can go back to my thesis that Marvel maybe has always, at least prior to the last 10 years or so, was often, I think, going for a younger audience, like teenagers, college students,
right.
I think. And while DC's decision, might not have been a conscious one, I think somehow it's always been a little more adult and bigger and more rooted in real mythologies and that kind of thing. Micronauts, as a story, appealed to my kids' side because it was based on a bunch of toys that I actually played with. They're little miniature...
They're robots?
Little miniature transformable type characters.
Are they robots or are they organic? What are these things?
They're hard to describe.
I'm
Some of them were like
the dorky questions here.
Well, the real dorky answer is they were roboids. Not androids, not robots, but roboids. That came from the series, not the actual toy line. That was an invention of the comic book story. But this idea that... I had a bunch of toys that I played with as a 10-year-old kid. I still play with toys well into past my 10-year-old time probably. And then they had all these stories that were based on these toys that I made up stories in my own head on as well. I knew it was a story building. Yeah. I used to put these toys together, and like a lot of kids probably, and like in my own head, nobody's watching me. I'm not being paid for this. Nobody cares. I'm just in my own head inventing stories around these toys that I adored, and suddenly they're on the printed page. And Bill Mantlo, God bless him, is writing really. A lot of people have a lot of love for this still. I go on Facebook once in a while and I'll talk with.
Oh, I see the geek talk about it too.
Illustrators who are still around who, even as illustrators, loved the days they were working on these Micronauts characters. And you know what? It's actually kind of hard to articulate exactly.
Well, it just sounds so like everything about it when you say it's based on a line of toys. It became a comic book. It became a cartoon. It just sounds like one step away from Smurfs. But I have seen the Geek Talk. People actually have a real strong affinity for it.
Okay, how about this? I guess one of the answers is, and I mentioned this to Kelly Jones on Facebook a few days ago. He was doing the art. He was doing the art for Micronauts, 25, 30 years ago. Still around, still doing DC Comics, just did a Swamp Thing miniseries. Really cool illustrator. Part of the allure was that the Micronauts and a few other Marvel series, although they were connected to this larger universe, like Superman is connected to the larger DC universe, the Micronauts and a few other series kind of inhabited their own little space. Like they were part of the Marvel universe. They would occasionally interact with, say, the Fantastic Four or the X-Men. But 95% of their stories had nothing to do with the Marvel universe. So you didn't necessarily have to be buying 5 other series.
Right.
There weren't crossovers. For the most part, there were a few crossovers with the X-Men and other characters. But for the most part, you could just enjoy the stories as a solitary series of tales. And that was part of the allure, too. And I think when I said Marvel was smaller, a lot of the characters, like the bulk of them...
You're smaller on a cosmological level.
Yeah, they all live in New York.
Right.
Like almost every single Marvel character literally lives in Manhattan. So you have all these, literally hundreds of characters.
And they actually call it New York, right? They don't call it
it's just New York.
Else.
There's no metropolis. There's
right.
no... In that way, it kind of connects to the real world, too, in more ways than one, because there's no metropolis or Gotham City or the Central City or
something?
Keystone City. Yeah. I mean, Marvel had just purely... real
States.
Real cities that they inhabited, but these characters like Daredevil and they somehow you felt like they were more real.
I can think of another example why they'd be more real. Like we're talking about geography. You're saying New York. I was saying, well, wait a minute. Also Germany, because you got, what is it, Magneto? He's a survivor of the Holocaust.
Yep.
They're folding in history.
Yep.
I don't. Yeah, you're right. It does become more real
Yep.
in that way. I never kind of thought of it that way because I don't really read them. But that your thesis does seem legit.
There's definitely more connections.
We got 2 minutes. ROM, go.
I don't know if I could talk about ROM at length. It was another toy as well.
Oh, it was a toy also.
Robot. Well, how about this?
I bring up ROM because Josh Baer, Underground Comics artist from New York,
loves that stuff.
He loves it, and he just took one issue, his favorite issue of ROM, and drew it in his very idiosyncratic style, but recreated that thing. That's the only reason why I'm asking, because I was kind of interested.
Well, you know what?
Josh Baer.
Instead of ROM, I'd actually.
Okay.
I got a minute and 45 seconds. I'll talk about X-Men.
X-Men
There's no doubt.
Less than 2 minutes. X-Men.
That the X-Men are, have always been hugely popular, both as comics and as movie franchises, as cartoons. They're, at the top of the list of characters, even more so than the big Avengers characters until recent years. They're immensely popular as characters go, and I think it was partly because I'm going back to my thesis, I guess, that especially as an adolescent, you connected with these characters who were essentially experiencing a very severe form of puberty. That once they once they hit adolescence, they weren't bitten by a radioactive.
Nobody likes me because my nose is too big.
Exactly. They weren't bitten by a radioactive spider.
Fat.
They weren't exposed to cosmic radiation. Mutants just hit 13 or 14, and suddenly. They, had some bizarre singular ability.
They grew breasts.
Yeah, and that often, by the way, was also a handicap.
Yes.
If you look at least the initial 20 years of those X-Men characters, almost every single one of them, their power, quote unquote, was really something that hurt them as well. Charles Xavier was obviously, handicapped. He was in a wheelchair. But you can go down the line of these characters.
The Frosty Girl. She can't
Frosty
touch.
Girl.
I don't know what her name is.
The Rogue. She
kills people or something.
Yeah, she touches people.
The dude with the eyes.
Yeah, he can't.
Cyclops.
He has to wear these visors, and he can't really, he can't uncover his eyes because he can't control his powers.
Right.
The Beast was literally an animal-like character. He didn't want to be an animal-like character. He didn't want to be.
Was he a beast though? He seems like he's a doctor or somebody.
He was incredibly intelligent. He was like the genius on the team. But the fact that he was physically transformed into this, animal-type character.
But his intellect was there. But he doesn't have that Incredible Hulk, go out of control kind of thing.
No,
okay.
if anything, he's exactly the opposite. He's
Gotcha.
incredibly, brainy. But I mean, as a kid, again, a 13-year-old. The tagline, one of the taglines for the X-Men is that they're feared and hated by mankind, right? And I don't know, as a 13-year-old, I felt feared and hated. Just being a 13-year-old man, a 13-year-old man
That's the source
boy.
of punk rock, man.
People just didn't like you.
We're back to comics
you
and
see
punk.
a few 14-year-olds walking on the street, you just want to punch them, right? That was the X-Men. that was me.
We're both high school teachers, and we love teenagers.
Of course we do. They're more beautiful than any adult that I've met, including myself.
For sure.
But anyway, that's our Marvel. That was DC and Marvel week to week, back to back, and Jeff getting away with murder, playing with his toys inside his mind out loud, and subjecting all of you to it. This is 99.1 KLBP, the Westerino Show. I am Jeff Guarino, and this is
Dean Westerfield, and we want to thank Teo Grasham and Paul Grasham.
99.1 KLBP, low power FM, Long Beach.